The knock on my door came just after 9 in the evening, the kind of sharp, authoritative pounding that instantly makes your heart sink. When I opened it, 2 police officers were standing on my porch, faces serious, hands resting near their belts. One of them looked at me and said, "Sir, are you the homeowner? We received a noise complaint. Your HOA called it in." I was genuinely stunned. Behind me, the house was completely silent. No music, no television, no guests. My wife was half asleep on the couch, our dog curled up at her feet. I honestly thought they had the wrong address, until the second officer added that this was the 3rd complaint filed against me that week. That's when confusion turned into anger. The HOA had accused me of blasting loud music late at night, disturbing neighbors, and refusing to comply with warnings. None of it was true. Not a single part. What they didn't realize was that my security cameras had been recording everything, day and night, and they told a very different story, one that proved the noise was never coming from my house. That moment, standing there with police on my porch, I realized this was never about noise. It was about control. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I live in a quiet subdivision just outside Red Willow Creek, Missouri, the kind of place real estate flyers describe as family-friendly and peaceful. It really was that way at first. People waved when they passed each other on evening walks. Kids rode their bikes in lazy circles until the streetlights came on. On weekends, you could smell barbecue drifting from backyards, and the loudest sound most nights was a distant lawnmower shutting off before sunset. That sense of calm was exactly why my wife, Emily, and I chose the place. We wanted stability. We wanted quiet. We wanted a home where nothing ever really happened. The Homeowners Association was the one compromise we accepted. Like most people, we didn't love the idea of an HOA, but it seemed mild enough. The rules were basic. Keep the lawn trimmed. No broken down cars in the driveway. Quiet hours after 10 at night. We followed all of it without complaint. We paid our dues on time, every time. We kept our yard neat. We barely interacted with the HOA at all during those first months, and honestly, that was how we liked it. For about 6 months, everything felt normal. Then the board elections happened, and a woman named Linda Hargreave became the new HOA president. I remember her from the meeting where she was elected. She spoke a lot about standards and accountability. At the time, it sounded harmless, maybe even responsible. Looking back, that meeting was the first red flag. She didn't talk about community or cooperation. She talked about enforcement. Almost immediately, the tone of the HOA changed. Emails became more aggressive. Notices were written like warnings instead of reminders. Linda ran meetings less like discussions and more like cross-examinations. If someone asked a question she didn't like, she'd cut them off or talk over them until they stopped. Still, none of that directly affected us, so we stayed out of it. Then the first letter arrived. It showed up in our mailbox on an ordinary weekday afternoon. The envelope had the HOA logo stamped on the corner. Inside was a single-page notice accusing us of excessive nighttime noise. That was it. No date. No time. No description of what the noise supposedly was. Just a warning that future violations could result in fines. I honestly laughed at first. I assumed it had to be a mistake. Emily and I aren't party people. We don't host gatherings. Most nights, we're in bed before 11, reading or watching something quietly. I figured the notice was meant for a neighbor and got misdelivered. Still, to be safe, I emailed the HOA. I kept it polite. I explained that we didn't make noise and asked if they could clarify when the issue supposedly occurred. Linda responded the next morning with a single sentence. Multiple residents have complained. No details, no explanation. Just that. That answer didn't sit right with me. If multiple people were complaining, surely someone could say when or about what. I replied again, asking for dates or times so we could address the issue. This time, there was no response. A few days later, another notice arrived. Same accusation, same vague wording. This one mentioned that fines would be issued if the behavior continued. That's when my unease turned into concern. We hadn't changed anything. We hadn't done anything. Yet somehow, we were already being treated like repeat offenders. I decided to install security cameras around the house. Not because I was paranoid, but because something felt off. I wanted proof of what was actually happening around our property. The cameras covered the driveway, the front yard, and the backyard. They recorded audio along with video. I figured that if this was all a misunderstanding, having footage would clear it up quickly. Instead, things got worse. Within a week of installing the cameras, we received our first fine. Still no dates. Still no times. Just a dollar amount and a warning that continued violations could lead to further action. I emailed again, attaching a calm explanation and offering to provide camera footage showing our house was quiet at night. Linda replied that the HOA did not need my footage and that enforcement decisions were final. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about resolving a problem. Every attempt I made to communicate was brushed aside. Every question was treated like defiance. It felt like the HOA had already decided I was guilty and nothing I said mattered. The escalation was fast and unsettling. Notices turned into threats. Threats turned into fines. And through it all, the HOA refused to provide even the most basic information. I wasn't being asked to correct a behavior. I was being ordered to submit. Standing in my quiet living room one night, listening to nothing but the hum of the refrigerator, I understood something clearly for the first time. The HOA wasn't interested in the truth. They were interested in control. By the third week, the tone of everything changed. What started as vague warnings turned into outright accusations. The HOA claimed I was violating quiet hours almost nightly. That wording alone made my stomach knot. Almost nightly. According to them, I was apparently running some kind of late-night disturbance operation, even though most evenings my house went quiet before 10. Linda's emails became sharper, more threatening. She warned of escalating fines, legal action, and even possible police involvement if I didn't correct my behavior immediately. That was the most infuriating part. There was nothing to correct. No loud television. No music. No guests. No backyard gatherings. Nothing. Emily and I spent our evenings doing the same boring routines we always had. Dinner, a little TV at low volume, lights off, bed. Meanwhile, my security cameras were recording everything, every single night, without exception. The footage showed a calm, silent house. It also showed something else, though I hadn't fully put it together yet. At the time, all I knew was that the noise complaints clearly were not coming from us. I decided the next HOA meeting would be the place to finally clear this up. I went in calm, prepared, with dates written down and a folder full of notes. I didn't even plan to argue. I just wanted answers. When the floor opened for homeowner concerns, I stood up and explained that I had been receiving repeated noise violations that didn't make sense. I said I had security footage that showed my house was quiet during the times in question. I barely got the sentence out before Linda cut me off. She told me, in front of everyone, that homeowner recordings were inadmissible and irrelevant. She said my defensive attitude was part of the problem and accused me of trying to intimidate the board. The room went dead silent. I looked around, expecting at least one neighbor to speak up, but no one did. A few people stared at the table. Others suddenly found their phones fascinating. No one met my eyes. I tried again, more carefully, asking how I was supposed to fix an issue when I wasn't being told what I was doing wrong. Linda didn't answer. She moved on to the next agenda item like I hadn't spoken at all. That was the moment I realized the meeting wasn't a forum. It was a performance, and she controlled the script. The fines escalated almost immediately after that meeting. What had been a manageable amount suddenly doubled, then doubled again. Each notice used the same vague language, accusing me of repeated violations without dates or evidence. One letter even warned that my vehicle could be towed for repeat non-compliance, despite the fact that my car was parked legally in my own driveway and had nothing to do with noise. The stress started bleeding into every part of our lives. I stopped sleeping well. Every creak of the house made me sit up in bed, listening, wondering if that sound would somehow become another complaint. Emily grew anxious too. She started whispering in our own living room, afraid that normal conversation might be twisted into another accusation. Our home, the place that was supposed to feel safe, felt like it was under surveillance. I tried one more time to resolve things peacefully. I reached out to the HOA and requested mediation. I offered, again, to share my footage. I even suggested meeting with a board member present so we could review everything together and clear the air. The response was a flat refusal. Linda wrote that the HOA did not negotiate with non-compliant homeowners and that further attempts to dispute enforcement would be documented as harassment. That word stuck with me, harassment. Somehow, defending myself had become harassment. A few nights later, just after 9 in the evening, there was a hard knock on the door. Not the polite kind, the official kind. When I opened it and saw 2 police officers standing there, my heart dropped straight into my stomach. They were calm, professional, but clearly responding to a call. They asked if I was the homeowner and explained they had received a noise complaint from the HOA. Standing there, barefoot on my own porch, trying to explain that my house was silent, I felt a mix of anger and disbelief I had never experienced before. This wasn't just fines anymore. This wasn't just intimidation. This was an abuse of authority, and it crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. As the officers looked around, listening to the quiet, I realized something important. The HOA wasn't just ignoring the truth. They were willing to escalate this until someone forced them to stop. And for the first time since this started, I understood that staying quiet and cooperative wasn't going to protect me. It was only going to make things worse. After the police left that night, apologetic, clearly realizing something wasn't right, I didn't go back to bed. Emily tried to reassure me, but my mind was racing. I sat at the kitchen table, pulled up the security camera footage, and started reviewing everything again from the beginning. Not just the nights tied to the complaints, but all of it. Every clip, every angle, every timestamp. That's when I noticed the pattern. At first, it was subtle. A burst of loud laughter carried through the night air. Music thumping faintly but clearly past quiet hours. Voices raised in the way people do when they've had a few drinks and think the whole world belongs to them. None of it came from my property. Every single time, the sound drifted in from the same direction. Linda's house. I rewound the footage, my heart pounding a little faster with each clip. Late-night gatherings on her back patio. Groups of people standing around talking loudly well after 10. Music playing at volumes that would absolutely qualify as violations under the HOA's own rules. In one clip, I watched Linda step outside, phone in hand, gesturing animatedly as she spoke to someone. A few seconds later, she pointed, clearly and unmistakably straight toward my house. I felt sick. I kept watching. On multiple nights, the same thing happened. Noise from her property, guests lingering late. And then, almost like clockwork, Linda stepping away, making a call, and pointing in my direction. It was impossible to misinterpret. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't confusion. This was intentional. Everything clicked into place at once. The vague notices, the refusal to give dates or times, the dismissal of my evidence, the way she shut me down at the HOA meeting. She wasn't enforcing the rules. She was using them. She was committing the violations herself and redirecting the consequences onto me. The anger hit hard, but underneath it was something sharper clarity. I wasn't being targeted because I broke the rules. I was being targeted because I was convenient, quiet, compliant. Someone she assumed wouldn't push back, and by blaming me, she kept the tension off herself. The next morning, I called a local attorney. I didn't even know exactly what to say at first. I just explained that my HOA had been accusing me of repeated noise violations, escalating fines, and recently called the police on me. The moment I mentioned the police involvement, his tone changed. He asked if I had documentation. I told him about the emails, the notices, the fines, and finally, the camera footage. When I showed him the clips, he leaned back in his chair and raised his eyebrows. He explained something that stuck with me. Filing a complaint isn't illegal, but knowingly filing false complaints, especially ones that involve law enforcement, absolutely can be. And when those complaints are part of a pattern of harassment or selective enforcement, things get serious very quickly. He told me that HOAs are not above the law, no matter how much they act like they are. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a shift inside me. Up until then, I had been reacting, defending, trying to explain myself to people who clearly didn't care about the truth. But now, I had evidence, real evidence. And more importantly, I had a plan forming. The attorney advised me to stop communicating directly with Linda. No more emails, no more attempts at clearing things up. Everything from that point forward would be documented and, if necessary, handled formally. He explained how selective enforcement worked, how HOAs could be held accountable, and how dangerous it was for a board member to misuse their position the way Linda had. Driving home, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. Not because the situation was over. It wasn't, but because I finally understood it. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. And I wasn't powerless. That night, as I walked through my quiet house, listening to nothing but the normal sounds of home, I realized how close I had come to backing down, to paying fines I didn't owe, to accepting blame for something I didn't do. That's exactly what Linda had been counting on. Instead, I started organizing everything. Emails printed and sorted, notices dated and labeled. Video clips backed up in multiple places. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was building a record, a clear, undeniable timeline of what really happened. The fear that had been sitting in my chest for weeks began to fade, replaced by something steadier: determination. Linda thought she was in control. She thought pointing a finger would be enough. She thought authority meant immunity. She was wrong. And for the first time, I wasn't just reacting to her moves anymore. I was preparing to make my own. Once I realized what was really happening, I stopped acting like this was a misunderstanding and started treating it like a case. Every interaction, every piece of paper, every email became evidence. I went back through months of correspondence and printed everything out. I highlighted dates. I noted times. I saved screenshots of emails and backed up every video clip from the security cameras in multiple places. If someone tried to deny this later, I wanted a record so clear it couldn't be brushed aside. At my attorney's advice, I also made a formal records request under state law. HOAs are required to keep documentation of violations, complaints, and enforcement actions, and homeowners have the right to see them. When the records arrived, they were revealing in ways I hadn't expected. My name appeared over and over again, flagged for repeated noise violations. Linda's name, on the other hand, was almost completely absent. That didn't make sense. Based on my footage alone, her property should have had multiple documented violations. Late-night gatherings, loud music, repeated activity well past quiet hours. Yet according to the HOA's own records, her address had a spotless history. No warnings, no fines, no complaints. That was the proof of selective enforcement. With that information, my attorney helped me draft a formal complaint to the HOA board. It laid everything out in plain language. The pattern of accusations against me, the refusal to provide details, the police involvement, and, most importantly, the video evidence showing the noise consistently originated from Linda's property. Each clip was time-stamped and matched to dates when I had received notices or fines. The initial response from the board was exactly what I expected. They tried to dismiss it as a personal dispute and suggested the issue be handled internally. That response didn't last long. My attorney sent a follow-up letter outlining potential legal exposure for selective enforcement, harassment, and knowingly filing false complaints. He cited state statutes. He referenced case law. The tone was professional, but the message was clear. Suddenly, the board wanted to talk. While all of that was unfolding, something unexpected happened. A neighbor knocked on my door one afternoon while Emily and I were home. She looked nervous, like she wasn't sure she should even be there. She asked if we could talk privately. Once inside, she took a deep breath and told us something that made my jaw tighten. She said Linda had approached her weeks earlier and asked her to submit a noise complaint against me. When the neighbor hesitated, Linda allegedly told her that my behavior was hurting property values and that the HOA needed support to deal with the problem. The neighbor admitted she never heard any noise from my house, but she felt pressured. She didn't end up filing a complaint, but she knew others who did. She wasn't the only one. Over the next several days, 2 more neighbors reached out quietly. One sent an email. Another left a voicemail. Both told similar stories. Linda had framed me as a troublemaker, someone who needed to be handled. She implied that cooperating with the HOA would keep things running smoothly for everyone. The message was subtle, but the pressure was real. With their permission, my attorney took formal statements from them. Suddenly, this wasn't just my word against Linda's. It was documented evidence of coercion, of manipulation, of a pattern of abuse tied directly to her position as HOA president. At that point, the next HOA meeting took on a different meaning. It wasn't just another uncomfortable gathering where homeowners got talked over and ignored. This one mattered. This was where the truth would either be buried or exposed. We prepared carefully. My attorney helped organize the evidence into a clear, chronological presentation. Emails first, notices next, then the footage, then the HOA records showing selective enforcement, finally, the witness statements. Everything was labeled, everything was backed up. Nothing was emotional or exaggerated. It was factual, calm, and undeniable. I won't lie, I was nervous. Even with all that evidence, standing up to an HOA feels intimidating. They rely on that. They count on homeowners backing down, staying quiet, or settling just to make the stress stop. But this time, I wasn't alone, and I wasn't guessing. As the meeting date approached, I felt a strange mix of anxiety and resolve. This was the point of no return. Either the board would finally acknowledge what Linda had done, or they would double down and force the issue into the open. One way or another, everything was about to come out. And Linda had no idea just how much was about to hit her at once. The meeting room was more crowded than I had ever seen it. Folding chairs lined the walls, and people stood in the back whispering to one another. Word had clearly spread that something big was coming. Linda sat at the front table like she always did, posture rigid, expression tight, tapping a pen against her notebook as if she were already annoyed by the delay. When she called the meeting to order, her voice carried that same practiced authority, the kind meant to shut down questions before they were even asked. She made it through the first agenda item before my attorney calmly raised his hand and requested the floor. You could feel the shift immediately. Linda hesitated, just for a second. Then she forced a smile and said homeowners would be allowed a brief comment period. My attorney stood, introduced himself, and stated clearly that he was representing me regarding ongoing enforcement actions by the HOA. The room went completely silent. Linda's smile faded. What happened next felt unreal. My attorney began by laying out a timeline. Not opinions, not accusations, just dates and actions. when the first notice was issued, when the fines escalated, when communication was refused, when the police were called. Each point was backed by printed documents that were passed to the board members. I watched their faces change as they flipped through pages they clearly had not seen before. Then came the footage. The lights dimmed slightly as a projector flickered on. The first clip showed my driveway late at night. Quiet. Still. No movement. No sound. A timestamp glowed in the corner, lining up exactly with one of the violations I had been fined for. The next clip played. And the next. Each one corresponded to another complaint. Each one showed the same thing, my house at rest. Then my attorney switched camera angles. The sound came through the speakers before the image fully resolved. Music. Loud voices. Laughter. The camera view settled on Linda's backyard. A group of people clustered around her patio, drinks in hand, voices carrying clearly through the night air. The timestamp matched another violation notice I had received. A low murmur rippled through the room. Clip after clip played. Different nights. Same source. Noise coming consistently from Linda's property. In one video, Linda herself stepped into frame, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing animatedly. She pointed directly toward my house. Someone in the audience actually gasped. By the time the footage stopped, the room felt tense and electric. People weren't whispering anymore. They were talking openly. A few heads turned toward Linda, others toward the board. No one looked at me like I was the problem anymore. My attorney didn't stop there. He brought up the HOA records obtained under state law. He showed how my address had been cited repeatedly, while Linda's had no recorded violations at all. He explained selective enforcement in clear, simple terms. He pointed out how complaints allegedly made by multiple residents had no supporting documentation. Then he mentioned the witness statements, the pressure placed on neighbors, the requests to submit complaints they knew were false. That's when the police report came up. The moment my attorney mentioned that law enforcement had been called based on a complaint the HOA knew or should have known was false, Linda lost control. She stood abruptly, knocking her chair back, and said this was turning into a personal attack. She accused my attorney of grandstanding. She tried to declare the meeting adjourned on the spot. It didn't work. One of the board members, someone who had barely spoken at past meetings, asked Linda to sit down. Another asked for clarification about the police call. A third said they needed time to review what had just been presented. Linda's voice rose as she argued, but this time no one backed her up. The authority she always relied on was gone. After a brief, tense discussion among the board members, they voted to pause all enforcement actions against me effective immediately, pending a full investigation. All fines were put on hold. All notices were suspended. The room erupted into overlapping conversations. Linda sat back down slowly, her face pale, hands clenched tightly in her lap. For the first time since I had met her, she didn't look confident. She didn't look in control. She looked scared. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors approached me quietly. Some apologized for staying silent. Others thanked me for standing up. I walked out of that room feeling exhausted, but lighter than I had in weeks. Linda avoided eye contact as she left. The confrontation was over. And for the first time, the truth had finally been said out loud. The investigation moved faster than I expected, and it went deeper than anyone seemed prepared for. Within days of the meeting, the board sent out a notice stating that an independent review had been initiated into recent enforcement actions. That alone was something I never thought I'd see. For once, the HOA wasn't issuing threats. They were explaining themselves. My attorney kept me updated as information started coming out. The first findings confirmed what we already knew. Multiple noise complaints filed against me had no supporting evidence, no consistent reporting, and no documentation tying them to my property. Several of the complaints had originated from the same source, Linda. Others had been submitted shortly after she spoke with certain neighbors. When those neighbors were interviewed, the stories matched the statements they had already given. Pressure, implication, fear of retaliation. Then the review turned to enforcement records. That's where things really unraveled. The investigators discovered a clear pattern of selective enforcement. Complaints against certain homeowners were aggressively pursued, while others were quietly ignored. Linda's address appeared repeatedly in internal notes as the source of activity, yet no formal violations had ever been recorded against her property. The rules existed, but only for people she chose to apply them to. And then came the financial records. Buried in HOA expense reports were payments to a legal firm that didn't match any approved board actions. The amounts weren't massive on their own, but the purpose was damning. HOA funds had been used to consult attorneys regarding Linda's personal exposure related to enforcement disputes. In plain terms, she had used community money to protect herself. That discovery changed the tone of everything. What had started as a dispute between a homeowner and the HOA president was now a full-blown governance failure. The board could no longer frame this as a misunderstanding or a personality conflict. This was misconduct. And it was documented. An emergency board meeting was called. Homeowners were notified. The agenda was short and very specific. Review of findings. Leadership vote. I attended, but this time I didn't feel anxious walking into the room. The energy was completely different. There was no posturing, no dismissive smiles. Linda sat at the front table again, but she looked smaller somehow, tense. Quiet. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. The findings were summarized aloud. False complaints. Selective enforcement. Financial misuse. Each point landed like a weight. When the vote was called, there was no dramatic argument, no drawn-out debate. The decision was nearly unanimous. Linda was removed as HOA president, effective immediately. The announcement hung in the air for a moment, heavy and final. Linda stood up slowly, said nothing, and gathered her things. No speech, no defense. Just silence. Watching her walk out of the room was surreal. This was the same person who had talked over everyone, dismissed concerns, and wielded authority like a weapon. Now, she had none. A few days later, the board issued a written apology to the community. It acknowledged failures in oversight, enforcement, and accountability. My name wasn't singled out, but the situation was clearly addressed. All fines issued during Linda's term were under review. Policies were being rewritten. External oversight was being considered. Then came the call from the police department. An officer explained that, following the HOA's internal findings, Linda had been formally warned about filing false reports. They didn't mince words. Calling law enforcement under false pretenses, especially as part of an ongoing pattern, was serious. Any further incidents would be handled very differently. Hearing that was validating in a way I didn't expect. It wasn't about punishment, it was about acknowledgement. Someone official finally said out loud that what she did was wrong. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter, people spoke more openly. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact before now stopped to chat. A few even admitted they had been afraid of crossing Linda. Afraid of fines, afraid of being targeted next. As for me, the sense of relief was overwhelming. Watching the situation unwind wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no shouting, no public meltdown. And somehow, that made it even more satisfying. The system Linda had manipulated so confidently had turned on her the moment it was exposed to daylight. Her own tactics, her own rules, her own paper trail had done the work. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. This wasn't revenge. It was accountability. Linda built her authority on the assumption that no one would challenge her, that no one would document, that no one would push back. She was wrong on all counts, and watching her lose control of the situation she created was strange, almost poetic. For the first time since this all began, I slept through the night without listening for sounds that weren't there. The official resolution came quietly, without drama, but its impact was unmistakable. A formal letter arrived from the HOA a few weeks after Linda's removal, this one written in a completely different tone than anything I had received before. It stated, plainly and without conditions, that all fines issued against me during the disputed period were being fully reversed. Any balances on my account were cleared. Any enforcement actions tied to the noise complaints were declared invalid. Just seeing that in writing felt like a weight lifting off my chest. A second letter followed soon after. This one addressed legal expenses. The HOA board acknowledged that I should never have been put in a position where hiring an attorney was necessary and agreed to reimburse my legal fees in full. When my attorney confirmed it was legitimate, I sat down at the kitchen table and just stared at the paperwork for a while. For weeks, it had felt like I was fighting a machine that couldn't be stopped. Now that same machine was admitting it had been wrong. New leadership was installed quickly. The board appointed an interim president while a proper election was organized, and the difference was immediate. Communication became clearer. Emails were straightforward instead of threatening. Rules were rewritten in plain language with specific examples and procedures. Enforcement guidelines were published so everyone could see how violations were supposed to be handled. Transparency, something that had been completely absent before, became the standard. One of the biggest changes was how complaints were handled. Anonymous accusations without supporting details were no longer accepted. Dates, times, and evidence were required. Homeowners were given the opportunity to respond before fines were issued. It was the kind of system that should have existed all along, but somehow never did until everything fell apart. As things settled, neighbors started stopping by. Some came with coffee. Others just waved me down while I was outside. A few admitted they had wanted to speak up earlier but were afraid. Afraid of fines. Afraid of being singled out. Afraid of becoming the next target. One couple told me they had paid hundreds of dollars in questionable penalties over the years just to avoid conflict. Another neighbor said Linda once threatened to tow his car over a technicality that didn't even exist in the rules. That's when it really hit me. I wasn't the first person Linda had gone after. I was just the one who didn't back down. Hearing those stories changed how I felt about everything. What started as a personal fight turned into something bigger. Standing up hadn't just cleared my name. It had exposed a system that allowed one person to misuse authority for far too long. The relief I felt wasn't just about my own situation anymore. It was about knowing that others wouldn't have to go through the same thing. Life slowly returned to normal. The tension in our house faded. Emily stopped whispering in the evenings. We started enjoying our backyard again without worrying about who might be listening. The cameras were still there, but they felt like a precaution now, not a shield. Nights were quiet again, the way they were always supposed to be. One evening, we sat on the porch as the sun went down, listening to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood. Distant laughter, a dog barking somewhere down the street. Nothing threatening, nothing wrong. Just life. For the first time in a long while, our home felt like a home again. Not a place under scrutiny, not a target. Just ours. The HOA still existed and probably always would, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like what it should have been from the start, a structure meant to support the community, not intimidate it. The ordeal was over. And in its place was something I hadn't realized I'd been missing until it returned: peace. Looking back on everything now, the hardest part of this whole ordeal wasn't the fines piling up or even seeing police officers standing on my porch because of a lie. It was the slow, unsettling realization of how easily power can be abused when no one challenges it. HOAs are supposed to exist to protect neighborhoods and maintain fairness, not to intimidate homeowners or silence them through fear and pressure. If I hadn't installed those cameras when I did, I honestly don't know how this would have ended. I might have kept paying fines I didn't deserve. I might have stopped pushing back just to make the stress go away. And Linda might have continued doing the same thing to someone else. Standing my ground wasn't easy, but it mattered, not just for me, but for every neighbor who felt too intimidated to speak up. The biggest lesson I took away from all of this is simple but important. Document everything. Keep records, stay calm even when you're being pushed, and never assume that authority automatically equals honesty. Bullies love hiding behind titles and rules, especially when they think no one is watching. Our neighborhood is quieter now, not just in sound, but in spirit. There's less tension, more trust, and a sense that people actually look out for each other again. That's what a community is supposed to feel like. And if you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?